Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to SFS alumni all over the world. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and it's great to be able to bring you one of our fast break analyses in the immediate aftermath of an important political event. We're going to have a half hour. We're going to keep to the time. We're going to try to keep the conversation sort of short, to the point, and give some time to you to ask questions. So obviously we had an extraordinary election, and the purpose here in our 30 minutes is not to relitigate the election, but really to kind of go beyond the rhetoric of the campaign and really try to understand what are the implications, what are the likely first steps, who are the people, who are the players, and what are the ideas beyond the rhetoric that are likely to shape a second Trump administration. And to do that, we are pleased to have with us Professor Matt Kroenig. Professor Kroenig is a professor of government here at SFS and in the college. He's also vice president and senior director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He served himself both in the Department of Defense and in the intelligence community during both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and also served in the first Trump administration. And he was also a national security advisor on the presidential campaigns of Mitt Romney and Mario Rubio. His own research focuses on U.S. national security strategy in competition with China and Russia. He's the author of 7 books, most recently being The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy from the Ancient World to the U.S. and China. And he has been, and I really want to emphasize this, he has been co-authoring a bi-monthly It's Debatable column at Foreign Policy magazine, trying to do what our mission at SFS is to bring different views together in debate and dialogue. And his commentary has been all over the place: the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Post, and news organizations throughout the world. So it's great to have you. So I am going to be asking Professor Kroenig really to give us his, to some extent, insider's view of what we are likely to expect from the second Trump administration. And I want to start with the most important, perhaps the most obvious question, but who are the likely candidates for the main foreign policy posts in the Trump administration? Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense. Who are the players? Who we should be looking for?
Great. Well, first, thank you very much, Joel, for the invitation to be here, and thanks to all of you for spending your lunch hour with us. And if you've seen online, there's a lot of speculation already, and there's been some vetting going on. But I'll start at Secretary of Defense, and so there, the 2 leading candidates seem to be Mike Pompeo, who was, of course, Trump's Secretary of State and CIA director, and then also Mike Waltz, who's a former Green Beret and a congressman from Florida. Senator Tom Cotton was in the running, but just yesterday dropped out, saying that he wanted to stay in the Senate, and people think that might be to prepare for a future presidential run. At State Department, there are a lot of rumors. Robert O'Brien, who was Trump's national security advisor in the first term, is mentioned as a candidate. Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, maybe the front runner at this point for reasons we can discuss. Senator Hagerty from Tennessee, he was Trump's ambassador to Japan in the first term, also in the running at State. So a lot of interest in the State Department position. And then at National Security Advisor, probably the lead candidate is Rick Grenell, who was Trump's ambassador to Germany in the first term, was had an inflammatory public persona, and was the only person with Trump, only foreign policy advisor with Trump when he met with Zelensky. So they have a close relationship. So those are some of the top names being floated right now.
And give us some sense of some of who these players are. I mean, we're not going to go through all of them, but, as you say, Grenell has been a bit of a lightning rod when it comes to rhetoric. Rubio is a much more well-known quantity, if you will. Pompeo also, as he sort of served. Tell us a little bit about these individuals. There is the view, of course, that now in Trump 2, he is going to be focusing much more on loyalists, rather than those who bring to the administration a worldview. But these are pretty serious people that you're mentioning. Describe, if you will, a kind of a worldview that you think that the Trump administration officials are likely to bring with them into the administration.
Yes, so I'll say a few things. One, for the most part, is kind of a traditional Reaganite Republican. I find this group reassuring. I think that these are all strong people with strong backgrounds who would serve any Republican president. So this idea that it would be unqualified loyalist, I think, is not true. You know, somebody like Rubio has been in the Senate for a decade, has served on major committees, Intel, Foreign Affairs, former presidential candidates. So I think these are qualified people. And I think the worldview, one of the terms that they used on the campaign is peace through strength when it comes to defense and security policy. This is also a term that Reagan used, actually that George Washington used. But I think essentially the idea is that the United States should be strong so that our adversaries don't challenge us. But if they do challenge us, I think a willingness to punch back, maybe more so than we saw in the Biden administration. You'll remember in the first term, Trump using force, for example, against Iranian General Soleimani or against the Syrians. But I do think the purpose is peace. It's a deterrence focus. And so I think there is a skepticism of kind of long drawn out military conflicts. And we've seen Trump saying that ending the war in Gaza, ending the war in Ukraine is a top priority. Seems like there was one other element to your question that I forgot.
No, I'm going to let me keep going, which is, you know, we talked about some of the civilian posts. One of the most, I think, interesting questions is going to be Trump's relationship to the military itself. In Trump 1, as you recall, he loved my generals. He loved those that looked the part. He brought in some very prominent and well-respected generals into the administration in various roles. And we all know, of course, that during the campaign, some of those very high-profile generals came out with some of the sharpest language that was used. And I wonder, you know, to what extent that might be shaping Trump's attitude towards the military, and for someone who wants to use the military for a peace through strength approach, and also the military's approach and the top brass of the military's approach to President Trump. So talk a little bit about the relationship of this new commander-in-chief to the military in a world in which the relationship with that top core you know, may have changed quite dramatically from Trump 1 to Trump 2.
Yeah, so I'll make a few points. One, if you look at the data, foreign service officers tend to lean left if you look at donations and things like that. Military officers tend to lean right. And so I haven't seen the data from the most recent election, but I would guess that the more military officers voted for Trump or were Trump supporters than Harris supporters. And of course, you know, they're nonpartisan. They serve whoever the commander-in-chief is. I know some military officers who refuse to vote because they don't want their loyalty to be questioned. But from the data we have, they do tend to lean right. Second, if you have a strong Secretary of Defense who Trump trusts, I think that will be key because there is the strong civilian control of the military ethos in the United States. Final thing I'll say is I read H.R. McMaster's book recently, who was National Security Advisor in the first term and one of Trump's generals. And he painted an interesting picture that essentially General Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense, General Kelly, who was Chief of Staff, and then Rex Tillerson, who had been Exxon CEO at State Department. McMaster said he was trying to take Trump's kind of unconventional background and view of the world and channel it in a constructive direction, and he thought he was succeeding in that. But he thinks that pretty early on, Tillerson, Mattis, and Kelly came to a different conclusion, that Trump doesn't know what he's doing. We're going to kind of tell our departments to ignore him and follow us, and that did lead to a dysfunctional policy process. So I guess my optimistic take is if you do have a team of loyalists, which isn't unusual, after all, Biden appointed loyalists to his cabinet as well, but qualified loyalists who Trump trusts, maybe like McMaster tried to do, they could channel his instincts in a constructive direction without the major policy kind of clashes we had in the first term.
Well, tell us a little bit, what does peace through strength actually look like? I mean, you know, Trump said, I'm gonna solve the Ukraine crisis on day one. Nobody would dare to, you know, risk my wrath, and therefore likely to temper their decisions. But we're in the middle of a world with active conflicts. We have an active conflict in the Middle East. We have an active conflict in Ukraine. We obviously have high risks in Asia. What do you think, and especially in the early months, what are the first tangible steps in a peace through strength approach, and in particular for the existing conflicts, let alone with deterrence for the future conflicts, which I know is the subject of much of your work?
Yes. Well, first, I think they'd say look back at the first term, and we did have peace in Europe and the Middle East. We had major wars erupt during the Biden years, and I think that they would argue that that wasn't an accident, that deterrence held under Trump. And I actually had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on this about a week ago, if people are interested, called Trump and the Art of Deterrence. So I think they have a point there. But then looking forward, Trump has been pretty clear that he wants to end the war in Ukraine. As you pointed out, he said he would do it in 24 hours. I don't think he means that literally. I think he means end it quickly. At one point, he even said it'll be solved before I take office. So I think that's kind of typical Trump bombast, but I think he means end it quickly. And what he said is that he would go to Zelensky and say, you have to negotiate. And I do think Zelensky would need to negotiate if that's what the US president asked. But he also said he'd go to Putin and say, Putin, you need to negotiate, or else I'll give Zelensky more than he's ever got. So essentially use the threat of providing more aid to Ukraine with fewer restrictions to get Putin to the table. And Putin has already said several times that he would negotiate. So then what does the negotiation look like? And Trump himself hasn't said, but people around him have spelled out what that might look like, which would be something like a ceasefire along the current lines. But then a key part of this would be making sure that Ukraine was continued to arm itself so that it could defend itself against future attack. And then I think there would be a lot of debates about what is the status then of this independent Ukraine. Is it brought into the EU? Is it brought into NATO and anchored in the West? From a security point of view, I think that could make sense. Politically, that might be difficult. Some people have criticized that approach, including during the campaign. I guess I would say I don't think we have a better strategy right now. This idea of arming Ukraine as long as it takes, but they're in a war of attrition with a larger power. They're running out of men. The Russians are regaining territory. So I think the current path would probably also get us to a stalemate. The Trump approach would just look to force it more quickly.
What about in the Middle East? Yeah.
Yeah, so turning to Gaza, again, Trump's only said a few high-level statements on this. He said that Israel needs to finish what it started and get it over with fast. Apparently, he's even told Netanyahu that he wants this wrapped up before he enters the Oval Office, is what I've been hearing. So again, he doesn't like the idea of long, drawn-out fights. I think he does like peace. But, get this over with fast, finish what you started. I think that where the Biden administration was trying to both support Israel, but also was concerned about collateral damage, and so constraining Israel to some degree, I do think the Trump approach would probably be more like, Israel, go ahead and do what you have to do, but finish it up with less of a concern of for collateral damage.
Now, I mean, you talked a little bit about peace through strength. We've talked about the fact that Trump doesn't want to get involved in new foreign wars. But we are in an enormously risky moment in the Middle East, in particular, with potential Iran reaction to an engagement with Israel. Putin is an unpredictable character. His desire to undermine NATO, not just in terms of what he's doing in Ukraine, but actually to some extent through maybe pinpricks through other parts of the NATO supply lines or the Baltics. So we could be in a situation in which the need to respond to military aggression, not to mention a potential Chinese engagement in Taiwan, is on the table. Given the relationship that Trump has had with the military, given his reluctance to get involved in foreign engagements, how do you see Trump marshaling American power in those kinds of highly risky, highly sensitive operations?
Well, first, I'd agree with you. I think we're in a very dangerous moment because, as you point out, we face challenges from China, Iran, Russia, North Korea. But what's different even from just a few years ago when the Biden administration wrote their national security strategy is that increasingly these countries are all working together. So we have this kind of new axis of aggression, North Korean troops in Russia, Iran and North Korea providing weapons to Russia, China really providing Russia the economic wherewithal to continue its war machine and other connections as well. So I think the challenge facing the Trump administration and US allies is how do you counter, deter, and God forbid, if necessary, defeat multiple adversaries at the same time. So some are saying this is the most dangerous moment we faced since the 30s and 40s. Some are saying this may be the most dangerous moment ever because unlike the 30s and 40s, today our adversaries are nuclear armed. And so what is the approach to this? I think one will be a big increase in defense spending as part of this peace through strength approach. So Senator Wicker, who will likely be chairman of the Armed Services Committee, has recently called for the U.S. to go to 5% of GDP as the defense spending level. So that would take us from about 800 billion today to 1.3 trillion if that goes through. Don't know if that'll be the number, but I think we can expect a big increase. Second, I think there is going to be a focus on allies doing more. That was, of course, a focus in the first term with Trump kind of complaining about deadbeat allies. The Biden administration continued to ask allies to do more. They just did it in a more polite way. I suspect that Trump will do this in a loud way. But he's right on the merits. I've talked to senior NATO officials who say that for European allies are going to have to spend about 3.5% on defense, percent of GDP on defense to get the capabilities called for in NATO's new defense plans. Currently, the threshold is 2%, and 10 or so of the allies are not even hitting 2%. So on the campaign trail, Trump has said they need to go to 3%, and I think he'll continue to do that. And again, I think he's right on the merits, although his style will probably cause challenges with European allies, with the politicians and publics, even if the ministries of defense understand. And then finally, I think there'll be a focus on strategic forces. In the first term, Trump talked about building a top-of-the-pack nuclear arsenal. On the campaign trail, he's talked about building an Iron Dome for the United States, essentially a missile defense shield for the United States. So I think that'll be the approach, strengthening the United States, asking the allies to do more to ideally deter these challenges and not to wait for the war to start and then have to fight it.
And I'm going to start pulling now from some of the questions in the Q&A. So please do, if you have some questions, you can put them through the Q&A. There have been several questions about NATO and your views of NATO. You talked about the, hey, you guys got to pay up approach to NATO. But we know, and it's been clear, the potential strains in Trump's relationship with the European power, Trump's relationships with allies. In a much more dangerous world that you describe, where the transactional approach per, kind of per controversy, per challenge, needs to be backed up by a stronger system of a consistent alliances that we can depend upon. There has been damage done in Trump's relationships with NATO. There's fears among the NATO partners. How do you see the relationship with NATO going? Are we going to still be back on this? If you pay, if you don't pay, you're out. I'd like to get more on that.
Yeah, I'll make a few points on that. And doing what I do in Washington, I meet with allied officials almost every day, including yesterday was doing a similar briefing for dozens of European ambassadors and engaging with them. So I think a couple of things. One, they know what to expect. They've dealt with Trump before. So I think the first time it came as kind of a shock. I think now they're prepared. Second, I do think the ministries of defense, the foreign ministries, the foreign policy professionals understand that the relationship is with the United States. The first term they got through. So I think they're cautiously optimistic about their ability to manage this. But I do think that the inflammatory rhetoric that we can expect will probably cause problems, again, more for publics and then politicians who need to channel their public's frustrations. On this idea of a two-tier NATO, Trump did say on the campaign trail, actually, first thing I should have said, Trump has said several times on the campaign trail that he will not pull out of NATO. So that was a fear some have had, but he said repeatedly he won't do that. But he has talked about a two-tier NATO. He said maybe we'll just protect the countries that are meeting their defense spending requirements and not protect the countries that are not doing that. My suspicion is that won't become actual policy. It would be difficult to do in practice. I think some of these more traditional Reaganite advisors I mentioned, like Rubio and Mike Pompeo, wouldn't endorse that. But I can't imagine that Trump will continue to muse about that, maybe as a way to try to generate leverage to frighten countries into doing more. So that's Europe. Quickly in Asia, the Trump administration should get credit for elevating this Quad framework, this kind of new proto-alliance between Japan, Australia, the United States, and India. So that is a multilateral thing that the Trump administration moved forward. And the Trump officials I've talked to say that the AUKUS framework, this kind of new security arrangement between the US, the UK, and Australia, they think is valuable and something they'd like to build on. So I think there will be an appreciation for alliances, but the style will be different than during the Biden administration.
And, there was a question asked about, and you used the term yourself, bombastic rhetoric. And as someone who thinks about deterrence, as someone who thinks about a systemic approach to foreign policy matters and the importance of signals, I really do wonder, if Trump continues in his normal style of using bombastic sort of rhetoric, how does it impact the kind of alliances, allegiances? We haven't even begun to talk about the impact of his rhetoric about migration and what it would mean, and several questions have asked about it in Latin America. I mean, I know that you're engaged with the Trump administration, but tell us how you think about it maybe from a scholar's perspective about what the role of this bombastic rhetoric might be to kind of create consistency and stability in a very, very dangerous and risky time.
Yeah, I think there are advantages and disadvantages of the rhetoric. When it comes to deterrence, I actually think there are advantages. So in the first term, he said to Kim Jong-un, if you continue to threaten us, you'll be met with, I think the quote was, fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen. He told the Wall Street Journal editorial board recently that he deterred Putin from invading Ukraine by saying, Vladimir, if you go after Ukraine, I'm going to hit you in downtown Moscow. I'm going to hit you so hard. I'm going to hit you. I'm going to take those domes right off the top of your head because, he lives under the domes. But I do think that that's part of deterrence, of clearly communicating to your adversary that if you go too far, there will be serious consequences. And I do think the Biden administration, with their kind of polite language, sometimes unintentionally undermined deterrence. So when Putin was massing forces on the border with Ukraine, for example, Biden said that the US military option was off the table, that a minor incursion might be acceptable. And I think he was probably trying to reassure a US domestic audience that, don't worry, I'm not going to get you into a big war. But I do think it had the unintended consequence of reassuring Putin that there wouldn't be serious consequences. So I do think it can have a benefit for deterrence. When it comes to allies and partners, though, I think there are some benefits. I think his rhetoric did frighten European allies into spending more during his first term. That wasn't the only thing driving them. They were also afraid of Putin. But I think the Trump rhetoric helped. But I think it also has a downside. I think it does shake the confidence that allies might have in the United States. Can we really count on the United States or not? Are they going to abandon us? Do we need to take security into our own hands? So, but that's just who he is. I don't think he's going to change his character at this point.
I want to ask, there were several questions about, for an SFS audience, not surprising, about Trump's approach to multilateralism, international organizations, aid and assistance through international organizations. What's your thoughts as to what a Trump administration is likely to be? Do you think he might pull out of some international organizations? What is this likely to mean for the agenda for aid and assistance? More broadly, how it might impact Africa and other nations that depend on that? A few words on that.
Yeah, and I do think this has been a divide. I still think there's a broad bipartisan center in U.S. foreign policy, but I think this has been a divide across the parties with, I think on the left, often seeing multilateralism and international organizations as a good in and of themselves. with I think Republicans being a little more skeptical and more transactional. Does this advance American interest or not? If so, we'll engage. If not, we'll not engage or pull out. And we saw that in the first term with him getting out of the Iran nuclear deal, getting out of the INF treaty, getting out of Paris. So I think we can expect a similar approach in a second term for institutions that they see as advancing American interests, like NATO, like the Quad, like AUKUS, like the Abraham Accords, another place where I think the Trump first term deserves credit. I think they will engage. Other places, I think maybe not. So I wouldn't be surprised if one of the first things he does is again pull the United States back out of Paris climate. In terms of development aid, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I focus more on security and defense issues, but I think that maybe one thing that's positive in this direction, I think there is a recognition that Russia and China are gaining inroads in the global South. How can the United States kind of get the global South on our side and not go with Russia and China? And it can't just be going and lecturing them. I think there has to be something on offer. So could the United States, working with Europe or Japan, provide offers of technology and other things that are an alternative to China? I think from a strategy point of view, that would be the right way to go, but I have no idea how Trump or his team are thinking about it.
Give us a little bit on China in particular, and China and obviously China's threats to Taiwan, as questions have been asked on the chat about this. Again, what do you think is likely to be a change from kind of classic Republican approaches to engaging with kind of great power rivals? This is a subject that you've worked on. So give us a minute on that.
Yeah, well, just a reminder that was the Trump administration the first administration that declared great power competition with Russia and China as the foremost priority of the United States. And then that's been continued essentially by the Biden administration. So a new area of bipartisan consensus. I think the Trump team has criticized Biden for saying a lot of the right things, saying that we'll defend Taiwan, but maybe not building the military to do that. So I do think defense buildup, prioritizing the threat from China will be a priority of the kind of traditional national security. Cabinet officials being rumored to take posts. For Trump himself, I think he has different priorities. I think he sees China, the central problem, essentially as the trade deficit. And we saw him try to did negotiate a trade deal with China in the first term that was essentially interrupted by COVID and then not followed through afterwards with Biden administration and Xi. So I do think that Trump and the people working trade and economic issues probably will try to re-engage China on that trade deal. And then also they've said pretty clearly that they are going to use tariffs as a tool against China, but also potentially against U.S. allies and partners where they feel like there are unfair trade practices leading to unfair trade imbalances.
Well, can you say, I mean, one of the things that concerns me, and I saw there's a number of questions from the panelists as well, from within the group. The domestic issues that he's concerned about for protecting the American economy through tariffs, the migration rhetoric and policies that he's likely to change, one doesn't get the sense that he fully understands the potential foreign policy implications of an aggressive tariff policy, an aggressive migration policy. People have been asking, what does it mean for our relationship with Latin America and our partners in Mexico? What does it mean? How is the tariff situation likely to spill over into our security engagements with China? To what extent do you think of the foreign policy side of the House in a Trump administration will just be in a reactive or strategic mode to these domestic priorities that could have very significant implications for security?
Yeah, first on tariffs, I suspect there will be a divide within the administration with the national security folks on board with tariffs and restricting trade against China for national security reasons. But I think these people realize that U.S. allies are a great source of strength. So let's focus on China and not pick fights and trade wars with allies. I do think that some of the people who are advising him on trade and economics, people like Lighthizer, do worry about trade imbalances, regardless whether it's friend or enemy. So I think there may be a dispute there that will need to be resolved. Talked to one expert recently who thought maybe there's even a deal with the Europeans of saying, okay, help us with our economic challenges with China, including de-risking your economies from China. And if you do that, then we'll go easier on you on tariffs and some of our trade differences. So I don't know how that'll play out. I think that will be a debate within the administration. And then on immigration, it's interesting. Kamala Harris essentially said that her policy would be to adopt this bipartisan legislation that Congress had come up with this summer. So I think now there is a bipartisan agreement that we do have a problem on the southern border that needs to be addressed. What doesn't get as much attention the first Trump term, there was an effort to reform legal migration with the purpose of attracting the best and the brightest, more of a reform moving away from family types of immigration, family reunification, and more focused on merit-based immigration. And I suspect that will continue. So probably the most controversial element of the migration policy is the promise or threat, I guess, depending on your point of view, to deport every irregular immigrant in the United States. But is that really possible? I've talked to experts who say essentially there's so many, it would be impossible. You'd have to build new organizations to do it. It would be very costly. In the vice presidential debate, J.D. Vance was asked about this, and he said, well, we'll start with migrants who've committed crimes. And then the follow-up question was, okay, and then what? And he said, well, after that, we'll have to figure it out. So I guess we'll see, but I suspect this campaign promise to deport everyone may not be possible in practice.
Well, I'm going to ask you one last question, which is, in the first 100 days, if you had to make a prediction of what might be most dramatic foreign policy move that the Trump administration makes in the early part of the term, what would it be?
I think it will be trying to negotiate into the war in Ukraine. Trump's been very clear on the campaign trail over and over again that this is what he wants to do. And I think here's a challenge to the School of Foreign Service and to others who think about this issue. I don't think we've even started to think through what this would look like. Who should be at the negotiations? Is it just Ukraine and Russia? Is it the United States? Is there a NATO seat at the table? What are the range of possible deals? What's acceptable? What's unacceptable? So I think this is the world we're going to be entering in 8 or so weeks. And I think it would be good to have the expert community outside of government to start helping the world think through that challenge.
Well, let me say, we designed these to be kind of fast break, lunch break opportunities to get some sense of what's happening in the immediate aftermath of dramatic political events. This is not the forum in which we kind of debate all sides of these issues. Plenty of the questioners and some of the chat as well have a lot of people who disagree with things that you said, Matt, not surprisingly. And we will have many opportunities to bring in faculty from other perspectives as some of these issues come to the fore. I hope not as dramatically, creating sort of security problems that require us to do a lot of fast break analysis to be able to understand what the implications are. But we really did want to get, at this moment, someone who has been engaged with the Trump team, someone who knows some of the players who are going to be making decisions, and get a feeling from within the Trump team about what we're likely to see in terms of appointments and next steps going forward. So we will save plenty of time later on for fast breaks to debate many of these issues as they come to the fore, as SFS alumni undoubtedly will be fully engaged in. And I appreciate everyone for joining us today for this fast break analysis. Thank you, Professor Kroenig, for joining us. And please stay out on the lookout for more analyses as they come, as we get and bring in more faculty and more diverse views about the challenges that we face ahead. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it and look forward to engaging with you again. And thanks for all being part of our broader SFS community. Take care now.